Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the JIIA webinar on the Ukraine crisis and the United Nations limitations and possibilities. I welcome all the participants. I serve as a moderator for the day. I am ICHIKAWA, Director General of this institute. On behalf of the organizer, I'd like to say a few words at the outset, and also I'd like to explain about how this webinar is going to proceed. We'll soon see the fourth month mark after the invasion by Russia into Ukraine started. And we have witnessed the limitations as well as the possibilities of the United Nations. According to the UN Charter, the Security Council is responsible for international peace and security. But on February 25th, Russia exercised veto, and therefore the resolution calling for withdrawal of the Russian army was rejected. And we still remember the scene where the Russian ambassador raised the hand of vetoing the resolution. That was the symbol of the limitation of the United Nations. And at the special emergency meeting, 140 countries supported the resolution to call for the withdrawal of the Russian from Ukrainian territory. That represents the soft power of the United Nations. But of course, it cannot represent or act on behalf of the UN Security Council. And at the same time, we see some activities for investigation of the war crime, and the resolution was also adopted by the United Nations to establish an independent committee, and also International Criminal Court (ICC) launched an investigation. When we hear the word or name United Nations, what comes up to the mind of many people? It may be about the high-rise building in New York City, or the meeting venue of the United Nations Assembly. But when we think about the United Nations, we also have to take into account what is called the UN family. That is entire UN organizations, including various other agencies and organizations affiliated with that. Right now, the UNHCR is there facing the humanitarian crisis, as well as UNICEF and other humanitarian organizations that are familiar to us, have been doing their utmost on the ground to support the people in Ukraine. At the same time, the food crisis that is brought about by Ukraine crisis, WFP as well as FAO issued warning about the gravity of this crisis. And according to UNHCR, back in the time when we started drafting the invitation, that those people who were displaced were 5 million. But now, when the invitation was actually issued, that was close to 6 million. Now I understand that it is close to 7 million. And at the same time, there are those Ukrainians that are displaced as evacuees within Ukraine. We strongly hope for the end to this crisis, yet we can't see the exit to this conflict. Thus, against such a backdrop, given the critical situation surrounding the United Nations, how the international organizations should respond to, and now that Japan was selected as non-permanent member of the Security Council starting next year, what Japan should call for and what actions Japan should take on, they will be discussed by the experts. The current crisis shed light on limitations and possibilities of the United Nations. Hope that this webinar would be the opportunity for you to consider the question that I have just raised based upon understanding about the United Nations. Today, first, we have Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, UN Under Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, who would give us a keynote speech, followed by the introductory remarks by panelists, and then Ms. Nakamitsu will join us in the panel discussion, and there will be the Q&A session to take questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function of the Zoom. If you have specific questions to a particular panelist or speaker, please identify to whom your question is addressed, and then please be succinct in your question. You can send questions either in Japanese or in English. And we start receiving questions from the beginning of the presentation. And in fact, even before this webinar, we received numerous questions. We may not be able to answer all the questions. Hope that you would kindly understand the situation. Now, without further ado, we'd like to move on to a keynote speech, followed by panelist remarks. So first, I'd like to invite Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, UN Under Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. I can't give you detailed explanation about her background, but I'm sure you know her. She has been with the UNGP as well as UNHCR, among others. She's quite active both domestically and internationally. And in fact, she is a friend that I respect and enjoy friendship for many years. Now over to you, Ms. Nakamichi.
Thank you for the introduction, Ms. Ichikawa. I'm in Rome, where I'm here on a business trip. And first of all, I would like to express my appreciation to JIIA. And I believe that this is a very important opportunity. And on June 3rd, it will be 100 days since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there's a big impact. And every day we are hearing the news. And we are all feel pained to see the suffering because so many lives have been lost and there are many evacuees. And also there is war crimes and also the violation of human rights seen on a daily basis. And therefore, we see untold destruction and human suffering. And there is the damage to infrastructure and also services to the people are gone, homes, schools, civilian buildings are now in ruins. So we see these shocking images every day. And in this way, we will be seeing the damages increase as winter approaches. And therefore, well, we will hear from UNHCR, and there will be reports from the ground. But for us, I think that this is indeed a shocking situation. And this war is not just limited to Ukraine, but rather vulnerable people, nations, economies have been all impacted: food, energy, finance. And from these three dimensions, we see the global crisis emerging, and especially for the developing nations, they have had to take measures for a COVID crisis and climate change, and the war occurred in such a situation. And there's also the increasing prices, such as food and energy. And so the situation, which was already bad before the war, is worsening. As Ms. Ichikawa mentioned, the food prices, the food price index, well, since 1990, when the records were took, we have seen a record high in March of this year. Crude prices are also rising, and therefore the economic inequality and social political instability is growing large. And for decades, we had the so-called international order based on rules in which the world was relatively safe, but now that is being threatened. which is a large problem. And that being the case, we in the United Nations, what kind of role should we play? And so for such possibility, what kind of changes or transformations are necessary? And this has to do with order, and we must consider the matter from such a perspective. And on this point, I would like to briefly take up three issues. First of all, in Ukraine, and there is the effort by the UN, and Moriyama-san will probably give a detailed report, so I'll be brief. And then second, with regards to the war in Ukraine, what is the UN doing to mitigate the effects? And the third point, and this is directly related to my own field responsibility. What about the security, disarmament, and arms control? What kind of specific efforts are we making, and why is it important? Well, in disarmament, there are various initiatives and also standards and rules. And to restore a rule-based international order, this is very important, and I would like to speak from such a perspective. So first is the UN activities in Ukraine. As Ms. ICHIKAWA just mentioned, I would also like to be very candid. This war in Ukraine started with the invasion by Russia, and the permanent member of the Security Council, one of its members violated the UN Charter, and that emphasizes the limitations of the Security Council and the UN. And of course, even before the war, we had seen divisions in the UN, but that has increased. And the threat to peace and the UN's overall capability to respond is being weakened. I think that's a fact. But what we are seeing in Ukraine right now is division among the major powers or increased competition and the eroding trust among nations, as well as the weakening of multilaterals. You might say that what we are seeing now is a culmination of what has been going on for years. As Ms. ICHIKAWA said, there is this division in the Security Council, but it's not that the UN has done nothing about the war in Ukraine. When we say UN is not functioning, well, if you hear such a discourse, it is important to understand the reasons and why that it may not be functioning. And to support the people of Ukraine, the entire UN system has been mobilized. And right now in Ukraine, more than 1,300 UN personnel are working in 8 different locations in Ukraine. And of course, there's UNHCR and UNICEF, such humanitarian assistance organizations, which are very active. And other than that, for example, we have the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and the High Commissioner is documenting and reporting the crimes, which is, of course, very dangerous. And the UNDP, too, the United Nations Development Program, receiving funding from the government of Japan, is working to dispose unexploded bombs in the vast areas of Ukraine. Also, as you know, there are the ports in Ukraine facing the Black Sea, and to release that to release grain to the international market, negotiations are taking behind the scenes. And also, this is my field of expertise. Ukraine had experienced Chernobyl, and so that such a catastrophe will not reoccur, the IAEA is working to ensure the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear power plant facilities. And they are also, as you know, continuing their visits to Ukraine. Now, secondly, in terms of the response globally, what is being done? You may have heard that Secretary General Guterres said that this war is not just an invasion on the Ukrainian people, but it is an attack on all the vulnerable peoples of the world. In particular, well, the impact of the war in Ukraine on developing countries, the Secretary General has established a global crisis response group on food, energy, and finance. And according to our analyses, approximately 69 countries are experiencing food shortage and inflation and supply chain disruptions, unemployment, and possibly many other risks. So it is a very serious impact, and food insecurity, extreme poverty, the worsening inequality around the world are of concern. And even in the developed countries, including Japan, the rising prices will hit the vulnerable populations hard. And with that, there could be more social disorder, and many of the existing conflicts other than Ukraine could be exacerbated. Also, we in the UN, other than on Ukraine, in various parts of the world, we are continuing the humanitarian activities, and the funds for such activities and development financing will be made more difficult. And with that, there will be hunger, poverty, gender equality, low-cost clean energy, inequality reduction. In other words, we are trying to, in the UN, achieve the SDGs, and the problems will weaken our ability to achieve these goals. Unless we act now, the risk is that we will fail to help the most vulnerable peoples of the international community. And it really is a critical situation. There was COVID-19, and to recover from the pandemic, there's also the abnormal weather situation. And last week, Secretary General said that this year's food crisis is due to access, but next year it will be because of real food shortages. And for example, if we think of Yemen and Afghanistan, or many countries in Africa, conflict is continuing, and also the Middle East, they are also facing extreme weather conditions. And if we can imagine that what is happening is quite shocking. And so the war in Ukraine has a global impact, and it's the triple crisis of food, energy, and debt. And what we need to do is quite clear. The first step is to stabilize the global food market, and though the war is ongoing, the exports of Ukrainian food products from the Black Sea, which is currently blockaded, must resume. And at the same time, Russian food and fertilizer also needs to be exported to the world market. I cannot say much more, but there is some active diplomacy taking place behind the scenes right now.
Third point, this is related to what I'm responsible for, that is disarmament and the security and the impact of war in Ukraine. What we are planning to do or what we have already done is going to be discussed. First, I'd like you to understand that even before the war in Ukraine, we have seen the structural change in the international security structure. That is, multipolar nuclear order is what we are seeing. We are entering into increasingly intensive competition among nuclear weapon states. And in the context of national security, nuclear weapons taking on even more importance, weight, and what is related to rule-based international order that is existing disarmament and arms control related treaties and norms started to be weakened. Then in addition to that, there are some crises where the use of a nuclear weapon was referred to, and emergence of the new weapons and technologies that lower the barrier of the use of nuclear weapons and what is called the new domain, like a cyber domain, where we are seeing the fast the progress of technology. Given those factors, what is now manifested in Ukraine is that international or global order is facing the extremely critical situation, which is extremely shocking. And in fact, in Ukraine, the nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons or deterrence by nuclear weapons are demonstrated in the worst way. That is, now the situation allows a nuclear weapon state to use the nuclear weapons without the punishment. I would say that is the worst form of nuclear deterrence. And what worries us is that some suggest that if Ukraine continue to maintain nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union that were deployed long time ago could have deterred the invasion. And in view of such reinstatement of the narrative or discourse, I would say that back in the time, the command and control of the nuclear warheads back then was already in Moscow, and therefore such a narrative is based upon inaccurate understanding of the situation. And from a point of view, I would say that for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, this is extremely dangerous message. And amidst such a risk, how can we restore the international peace and order? That's what we have to consider. Why is it necessary? As I have been stating, there are various disarmament and arms control related treaties and norms. They constitute important components of international order with the UN Charter as a core. Now that we are witnessing the war in progress, why arms control, the disarmament, and non-proliferation, such norms are essentially important. That is, the disarmament is not just the conceptual idealism. In fact, it is a tool for security. That is why we need to pile up our efforts and strengthen the order. And rather than giving up the efforts that were made so far, we have to consider how we can stop such a trend of increasing violation of those norms and weakening of such regimes. We have to consider what we can do, but of course, there is no quick fix to that situation. In fact, to resolve various challenges that the international community is faced with, there is no such thing like the silver bullet or quick solution. Therefore, each state has to be seriously engaged in multilateral negotiation at UN and other related venue and try to achieve a recovery step by step. But I believe there are some opportunities. And for such efforts, what is most important is the 10th review conference of the parties to NPT taking place in August this year. That could be the great opportunity to resume such efforts. And at the review conference, I believe series of important agreements have to be achieved, and right now we are in the process of preparation by way of meeting and negotiations. First of all, for 77 years, non-use of nuclear weapons, the norm that nuclear weapons should never be used, that norm that has been maintained for 75 years has to be observed. Secondly, as a way to reduce the risk of nuclear war, we have to come up with extremely important and the essential agreement in an expeditious manner. And in fact, the review conference could be adding great momentum to disarmament. And not only disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation, but also we have to reconfirm that the treaty is a major pillar of the peace and security, and that at high level there has to be an agreement to observe the provisions under the treaty. The only way to strengthen the taboo against the use of weapons of mass destruction, that is, each member state of the treaty has to strictly observe the obligations and responsibility. But as the world is getting more and more multipolar, in view of extremely and increasingly complicated international security regime, United Nations has to respond to the needs arising from such a new situation, including cyber, space, AI, and emerging technologies that will bring about various threats and new challenges. They have to be projected and have to make a preparation duly. Of course, that goes beyond the control of the single state, and therefore, the multilateral negotiations that are going on in different domain and area have to move forward. So that's a kind of critical juncture that we are currently in. By accumulating such efforts, extremely at the time of crisis, that is extremely difficult. But rather than thinking that nothing is done, because of the difficulty of the situation, we have to consider how we can bring about success to such a negotiation. Now, in conclusion, talking about international order, it is not something that is created by an effort by the single state. In fact, we have to revisit the importance of the multilateralism. Therefore, at this juncture, I'd like to share with you briefly my thoughts about the role of the United Nations. First of all, in view of a major crisis like the one that we are seeing right now, we have to ensure the functioning of the UN system so that it can respond effectively to all the areas, including humanitarian, human rights, and security, among others. And second point, which is less often discussed, that is the importance of use of data, objective data, and the accurate information, especially in the age of misinformation. Accurate and correct data are extremely important, and United Nations is in the position of gathering them and offer them to those who need. And then, using such an information, we have to be preemptive by advocating appropriate policies and measures, including food crisis, in order to prevent or avoid or mitigate the crisis that could arise. Third, in terms of the political role, even when nations are divided, according to the UN Charter, in the process of seeking for a solution, we have to continue to provide the venue for all the member states to be engaged in. And the United Nations is a venue with universality and authenticity for negotiation as such. and order is created by developing international agreement and norms. For that, the United Nations is the only one and only international organization that has such universality, and therefore it is best suited to work on development of such norms. And when we anticipate the coming crisis in pursuit of peace, we should not tolerate double standard. Our efforts through United Nations refers to the extremely important principle of SDGs, which states nobody is left behind. This is something that we have to always keep in mind and remind the international community and continue our endeavor in alleviating the global impact of Ukraine crisis. And at the same time, we need to work on other fronts, including Afghanistan, Syria, Myanmar, and Yemen, among others. Why double standard is dangerous? That is because to restore international order, at least vast majority of member states of the United Nations have to work together and have to be united. Therefore, the sense of solidarity, the unity has to be maintained. Last but not the least, as is often reported by media, I'm sure you are interested in the UN reform and Security Council reform. It is a fact that the Security Council is no longer functional when one of the permanent member becomes a party to a conflict. But this is nothing new. We need to respond to that situation immediately because of serious nature to the international order, and yet there is no quick fix to such a situation. But for instance, recently, Liechtenstein took an initiative in proposing resolution, which was adopted by consensus, referring to the call for explanation when the veto is exercised. This was triggered by the war in Ukraine, and I believe this is one of the important steps forward toward the reform. The various options for reform have been discussed, but I believe all the member states of the United Nations have to understand that we are the United Nations, and therefore each member state has to take a responsibility in working on the reform of the Security Council. Now, against such a backdrop, according to Secretary General Guterres, at the time of the General Assembly commemorating 75th anniversary of the United Nations, according to the call made by the resolution, he issued a report entitled "A Common Agenda." This is a first step toward the vision for the future, taking into account the fast-changing international order. And this is going to be discussed at the future summit that is scheduled next year. And that's where he is focusing on preparation. I would say we are now at the turning point of a destiny. And this is a strong message that has been repeatedly issued by Secretary General Guterres. We are now at the historical juncture. We have to make sure that the future is peaceful, and therefore all the member states and Japan in particular, which is going to be a non-member state, the non-permanent member of the Security Council, have to work together with the members of the Security Council. We should strive to demonstrate the political will, which is rather difficult to define from time to time. For that, the coming months and years are going to be extremely important for us. Therefore, on the part of UN Secretariat, we should be always based upon underlying values of the United Nations and continue our endeavor. Thank you very much.
Undersecretary General Nakamitsu, thank you very much for a forceful and instructive lecture. What's happening in Ukraine and the UN activities for the Ukraine war itself, and also the mid to long-term impacts on the world and the UN's initiative, and your expertise of this security and disarmament and arms control, especially non-proliferation efforts were mentioned, and also the UN's action itself, pathway to the future challenges. I think you gave a very broad speech. And in the panel discussion, I hope to hear from you further. Now, following this, there will be the panelists and commentator introduction, and we would like to ask them for the opening remarks. The panelists, and if you could show the screen. So following this, in the following order, there will be a remark first from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have Deputy Director General, Mr. Yutaka ARIMA, and I think all of you know the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Ukraine to Japan, Ambassador Sergiy KORSUNSKY, and then UNHCR Senior Emergency Coordinator, Mr. Takeshi MORIYAMA. Right now, he is in Bulgaria to try to respond to the refugees or evacuees from Ukraine. And then after that, engaged in global news reporting for a long time, we have from NHK World Japan, Miki EBARA, and there will be a provision of comment, and then Ms. Nakamitsu will join us for a discussion. So, viewers, Ambassador KORSUNSKY naturally will be speaking in English, and the other panelists and commentator will be speaking in Japanese. So please keep that in mind when selecting the language.
Thank you for introduction. I am ARIMA, a Foreign Affairs Minister of Japan. Ms. ICHIKAWA, thank you for the invitation. We have just heard about the presentation by Ms. NAKAMITSU from UN point of view. I'd like to share with you their thoughts based on perspective of the government of Japan, international order and its foundation that have been developed by strenuous effort and the precious sacrifice over many years by in the international community are now threatened due to the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. And this is the outrageous act that threatens and that would shake the international order not only in Europe but also in Asia. And therefore, the Japan as well has adopted unprecedented anti-Russian measures by accusing Russia in a resolute manner. First of all, we have implemented the total of $200 million of urgent humanitarian aid under a collaboration with NGOs and other international organizations to Ukraine and surrounding nations, and also the fiscal support to Ukraine in collaboration with the World Bank totals $600 million, and they are intended to support Ukraine economy under cooperation with World Bank and international community, and we're going to work together with G7 and consider what we can do. And we have to make clear that all the countries, nations have to learn that no state will be rewarded for violation of such an international order. And trying to change the international order by force unilaterally. And the current outrageous act by Russia now raises a question about the qualification of Russia as the permanent member of the Security Council, and also because it exercised veto. And now the the challenges inherent with the United Nations are now highlighted. And despite that, the resolution on invasion into Ukraine, as well as the resolution on humanitarian impact of the invasion, were supported by more than 140 countries in the special the General Assembly, the conference, and also the call for the suspension of the Human Rights Council membership of Russia was also adopted at the UN General Assembly. That is quite important because it was demonstrated at the UN General Assembly, which has such a high level of universality. Russia, the permanent member of the Security Council, which should be responsible for peace and security on the international community, has taken such an action to undermine the foundation of international order, points to the need for the reconstructing the way the international order should be developed. G7 have been so far effective in responding to the invasion. In responding to the strategic challenges such as China and Russia, and we should work together with the countries of democracy centering around G7 and take a leadership. On the other hand, the world is faced with the numerous conflicts and other challenges. And for the prevention and the peaceful resolution of conflict, the maintenance and the establishment of peace, the many countries turn to United Nations and its the role of the Security Council. As was mentioned by Ms. NAKAMITSU, United Nations is in fact playing an important role in the various occasions. Japan was selected for the 12th time as the non-permanent member of the Security Council. And through the close communication and dialogue with other relevant countries, we should continue to cooperate so the Security Council should perform its the original role, and at the same time should try to maintain and strengthen international order according to the rule of law. By maintaining the universality and authenticity of the United Nations, we have to consider how we can complement the limit to the United Nations and reform and strengthen, and including Security Council reform, the further active use of the UN General Assembly, as well as the introduction of the perspectives on the conflict prevention, among others, have to be taken into account for strengthening the United Nations.
The situation in Ukraine has highlighted the problems facing the Security Council, but these problems have existed since the founding of the UN when the veto power was incorporated into the system. On the other hand, there are cases such as the peace agreement in Yemen, in which the Security Council functions effectively if a permanent member does not exercise its veto power. On June 8th, the Security Council rejected a US proposed draft resolution strengthening sanctions against North Korea because of the veto power exercised by China and Russia, and a meeting of the General Assembly was held to seek an explanation from the two countries that exercise the veto power. When the veto is exercised, including when an emergency special session of the General Assembly is held, there is a request for a General Assembly session on the situation in which the veto is exercised. This was the first meeting based on such a Liechtenstein resolution. The meeting provided an opportunity for countries that had exercised their veto in the Security Council to explain the reasons for the veto, and we believe there was a certain significance. And first of all, there is the holding of an emergency session of the UN Generation regarding Ukraine, and then also resolution of the General Assembly led by Liechtenstein seeking the General Assembly session when the veto is exercised, and also as an initiative to restrain veto power, France and Mexico's political declaration aiming for the voluntary restraint of veto in the case of large-scale atrocities. And also there is a code of conduct proposed by the Swiss-led group, which proposes that no members, including non-permanent members of the Council, vote against the resolution. In discussions on Security Council reform, there's an opinion that Russia should be expelled from the Security Council, but under the UN Charter, a member state cannot be expelled or have its right suspended without the consent of the permanent members. the United Kingdom and United States are not advocating the expulsion of Russia in contrast to the case in the Human Rights Council. Therefore, in order to solve the problems facing the Security Council, it is important to increase the representation and legitimacy of the Council by adding new permanent members from the world's leading countries, including Japan, and increasing the number of non-permanent seats on the Council. However, the expansion of the permanent membership of the Council also requires a revision of the Charter, which must be adopted by a two-thirds majority of the members of the General Assembly and ratified by two-thirds of the UN member states, including all permanent members of the Security Council. Permanent members of the UN Security Council have a de facto veto power over amendments to the Charter, so it will not be an easy task to achieve this. In light of this, what Japan should do is to lobby both inside and outside the UN, and within the UN, Japan should strengthen the UN as a whole by strengthening the functions of the General Assembly and also supporting the Secretary General's efforts. And outside the UN, Japan should continue to cooperate with the G7 and other like-minded nations to work on the balance of power among major powers to maintain international order. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arima. The position of the government of Japan in view of the current international situation as well as situation in Ukraine and the direction that Japan is moving forward will explain. Now I'd like to turn to Ambassador KORSUNSKY, Auxiliary and Plenipotentiary of Ukraine to Japan, please.
Thank you very much for invitation and for this opportunity to talk about extremely important issue, which is unfunctioning United Nations Security Council mechanism, which should prevent the war, but it was not able to do so. Let me to remind you that the war of Russia against Ukraine began 8 years ago, in February 2014. So since then, we have seen several General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia, recognizing the illegality of annexation of Crimea. Then Russia was blamed for the war in Donbass. So we have seen several important decisions of the United Nations General Assembly. But United Nations Security Council was not able to act because of the reason which was already mentioned, that a permanent member with veto power is fully responsible for this aggression. What happened on 24 February this year, that was a serious escalation of the aggression of Russia into full-scale war. And again, we see exactly the copy-paste situation when we have a very strong language in United Nations General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia for this aggression. And again, absolutely unable to act anything by the United Nations Security Council. So that means that 8 years, they were almost lost. We were not able, the international community was not able to qualify the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, illegal seizure of the territory, as here in Japan, it's very good saying that change of status quo by force has happened, but Russia was not punished. Sanctions introduced by international community, they were not related to decisions of the United Nations Security Council. Yes, we have used those several resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly to use it against Russia in different courts, international courts. Decisions were taken in our favor and fully ignored by Russian Federation. So what we have right now, aggression continues, more than 20 million people displaced, half of them internally, half of them have had to left Ukraine for other countries, including approximately 1,250 or something to Japan. In the parallel to that, a very, very troubling situation when the United Nations Security Council is not able to act because of veto power of Russia and China, we are very grateful to other bodies of United Nations system, specifically to United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We're fully aware about the efforts in the framework of this office. We are fully aware about UNICEF efforts to help refugees, whatever they're called in Europe, because in Japan we use word evacuees. So probably in Europe they still use refugees. But nevertheless, that's very important. And Japan is a very responsible member of the United Nations, use United Nations system to supply its part of the humanitarian assistance to Ukrainians in Romania and Poland and to Ukraine itself. So we are now very much hope to see UNESCO acting accordingly, because Russia has destroyed and continue to do so very important cultural, religious and historical monuments, museums and sites protected by UNESCO. We see looting of museums and artifacts of immense pressure for our history. And they're not shy even not to hide that. So they're doing this very openly. We very much hope that in spite of the fact that Russia is a big contributor to funds managed by the United Nations, and by the fact that Russia is very heavily represented in different secretariats and offices of the United Nations, in Geneva, for example, and in New York and in Paris, the international community will act accordingly in unity, because what is happening is endless and terrible atrocities unthinkable in 21st century. They have been recorded not just by Ukrainian teams of investigators, but by international teams we invited from different countries. We specifically continue to work in a diplomatic front to bring authorities, and you know, Secretary General himself visited Ukraine. He have seen those sites in Bucha and Irpin, those small cities, but there's just two. We can name dozens of similar places where unimaginable atrocities happened: torture, rape, looting, and destruction of infrastructure, civil infrastructure, hospitals, schools, purposefully. It is absolutely clear that Russian goal is to wipe out Ukraine and Ukrainians from the face of the earth. They are not hiding this. They are openly saying this. And Russian representative Nebenzia in the United Nations Security Council, he continues to say lie after lie after lie. Everyone knows that, and we can do nothing about this. This should not be happening. It is absolutely clear that drastic reform of United Nations security system is already overdue. There are different models of this reform. They have been discussed many years in different formats, but probably it's time to act. In addition to that, I think that it's important to look much more closely on the system of international court established on the UN authority. Probably we have to establish not just courts, which decision Russia fully neglect, but as well codes, which would demand from UN members to act in according to decisions of the courts, in order to show any possible future aggressors that aggression will be punished by law, not by will of each particular country. And what I would like to stress that Ukraine being in an extremely difficult situation right now, we think we try to be part of international efforts to reconsider, reestablish, reinforce the international system of security, which will make impossible future war specifically here in Asia. You know better than anybody else. You should not remind you what kind of tensions we have here in Asia. And it is absolutely unimaginable that this part of the world where you have 60% of world population and GDP has been created to be engulfed in a war just because one country thinks that the territory of other country is under question. So I would like to stress again, we understand all the positive sides of the United Nations system, and we unfortunately face inability of the main body which should protect us from this aggression, inability to act. It's time to work, it's time to act, it's time to discuss in a comprehensive manner what can we do together in order to strengthen the system, to change it. I'm not even discussing now, but those who works in United Nations headquarters in New York, they know well that Russia was never even admitted as a member of United Nations. Russia possessed the place in the United Nations Security Council in an illegal manner. This is absolutely clear for us, and our ambassador to United Nations has been talking about this endlessly, but nothing happening. So that's like a real politic, but this real politic may cause much bigger conflict than we have now in Ukraine, which when we see now a nuclear threat from Russia. You know what the question I'm constantly asked here, and even today in the interview with Asahi Shimbun, and yesterday the meeting of another research body about nuclear weapons. Ukraine decided to give up in 1994. Whether Ukraine feels insecure now, let me tell you, Ukraine fully supports non-proliferation regime. Ukraine never was thinking about being a nuclear power and to threaten other countries. But this example is bad example when security guarantee is given to Ukraine cannot be enforced right now by international community, which by word and by language is very grateful to Ukraine for being showing an example that in a civilized world you can live without nuclear weapons and be secure. So please, for those who can influence this, I urge you to act, and we are ready to do so. We are fully understand that it's only in concert, only together, we can stop finally to stop aggressions which are still happening in 21st century. Thank you for your attention.
コルソンスキー大使、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Ambassador KORSUNSKY. I was struck by the fact that today's the war started actually 8 years ago, and you mentioned about the context, and also you referred to the UN system and UNHCR and UNICEF, UNESCO, the UN system in its entirety, and their activities were also referred to. And also you mentioned about positive aspect, and at the same time, the Security Council that is not functioning, which is a major focal point recently, and the nuclear non-proliferation, Ukraine commitment to that, and dilemma for ensuring security. And those are the points that I like to take note of. Now, I'd like to turn to Mr. Takeshi MORIYAMA, Senior Emergency Coordinator of the UNHCR, who is actually working on the ground. Thank you, Ms. Ichikawa, and for the invitation to such an important panel discussion. As was introduced, I am right now in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, and I'm going to meet with the families who fled from Odessa of Ukraine, in Ukraine as well as in Odessa. What is called the Bulgarian, the descendants who fled from the conflict with Turkey, and there are more than 150,000. And there are many Ukrainians who speak Russian, but already many people already evacuated from Odessa to Bulgaria. It was on February 24th that invasion started, and ever since, more than 320,000 evacuees fled to Bulgaria, and more than 110,000 are registered under temporary protection of EU. This is a system that grants special measures. So once you're registered, then the resident, the permit, the right for education and employment are granted on a temporary basis. And about 110,000 the people under temporary protection, that is the 3 times more than those that are registered in Poland, and Romania rather. And in Romania, so far, 1.1 million people went into Romania, but many of them eventually moved to Bulgaria and other EU member states. And because Bulgaria, like Ukraine or Serbian, and also we use the same the letters of the Slavic origin, and Bulgaria, they're from Ukraine as well as Afghanistan and Syria. We have received so many refugees and evacuees. Led by Poland right now, there are more than 5 million refugees having so far recorded, registered in Europe. And also we are seeing increasing number of people crossing the border from Ukraine. 7.5 million already left Ukraine. To be more exact, it is not about the sheer number of the people, but rather the 7.5 million times that people crossed the border. And then the 2.4 million people, many of them went back to Ukraine to see how their houses and towns used to be, and also to be reunited with the rest of the family members. So it was not the return of the people, but the conflict continues, we expect that there will be more complicated the movement of people. There are more than 7 million refugees and evacuees. And if the war continues to last and even be intensified in the east and south, then there will be more evacuees that are displaced internally with that go across the border, and therefore the currently contingency plan is under development by UNHCR. And about the fundamental issues, if the war continues until winter, and then together with the food price increase, we will start to see the impact of the energy crisis because the gas supply is stopped.
Including the war in Ukraine, there's the conflict and the violence, and the number of people who have fled is more than 100 million, which is an amazing number. And UNHCR first had a time limit of 3 years, but Madam Ogata became the High Commissioner of UNHCR, and she emphasized human security in 1991, and there is the regional conflict due to many reasons, including religion, and that is increasing. And there should be some distance from the politics, and it should observe the rules of neutrality and fairness. And the solution needs political will. It has to be done politically. And in the European nations, with regards to health and education and the evasion of violence based on violence, there are many assistance projects taking place, and also with cash. And today, if you look at the world, in terms of military industry, more than $2 trillion is being spent. there are 142 international organizations and NGOs, and in the dealing with refugees, the amount necessary for Ukraine is about $1 billion, and this amount is 0.09% of what is used for the military spending. I myself in Myanmar and South Sudan and Afghanistan, I have supported refugees in many places, and communication I felt to be really important. And the communication I'm talking about here is not just providing information, but rather it has to do with people-to-people understanding. That is, each person's situation has to be understood, and you have to put yourself in that person's shoes. In particular, with regards to the assistance to the Ukrainian refugees, the camps, we have to think about the grasping of each individual, which is very difficult. Therefore, the local volunteers and the evacuee himself or herself will help the following refugees, and that is very useful. And the passion of the volunteers can be felt, and not just to become useful, but by acting, you could say that resistance is being shown to the aggression. And to unify the volunteer activities, UNHCR is looking at the civil activities and trying to coordinate using mobile applications, and UNICEF and the Red Cross, with the Bulgaria government, we have created Blue Dot, and it is where the evacuees reach. For example, in Sofia, central station, and the hospitals and counseling support is being provided. And the need for counseling is increasing. And the other day, from Bucharest to Sofia, there was an elderly woman who arrived there from Donbass, and she had lost the will to live. But somehow we were able to give counseling to this woman. And the situation in the war and the situation of the evacuees are known best by the evacuees themselves. And through Facebook and other social media means, communication is being made. But in terms of accuracy of the information, I believe there is some problems. At any rate, with regards to the displaced persons of Ukraine, I think the distance or the gap is narrowing between the refugees and the providers of assistance. And I believe that the assistance structure will expand, and our job is to listen to the requests of each country. And basically, we have dialogue with the refugees so that with each and every refugee, we can provide assistance. And going forward, we will be strengthening the collaboration with those providers of assistance. So the key is human security, and should be based on peace and maintenance of security in the international community. And it should be based on the receptiveness of the local community through the UN, peace and the realization of security. It also requires such a microscopic view, and you also have the macroscopic view of the UN Security Council. And finally, as a Japanese employee, sensitivity to nature, the cooperation, consideration. I think from the microscopic and macroscopic view, both we can contribute to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moriyama, for voicing the situation based upon your work on the ground. You told us how the UN system is working in different locations, especially the Ukrainian evacuees, their situation, and the comparison with the military spending, how much is required in order to support them. Your presentation was quite informative, and inspirational. Now, based upon those the presentations and comments, I'd like to turn to Ms. EBARA to give us a comment. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I am EBARA of NHK. I'm very much delighted to be part of this webinar. The Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, those are the regions that I was dispatched as the international correspondent, and also I went to cover the UN headquarters. And I came to a conclusion, and still, against all odds, the United Nations is necessary for the international community. That's my observation. And now, I'd like to offer a different perspective about the war in Ukraine based upon observation from Japan. As we heard, the citizens level, strong sympathy is expressed by the Japanese people. Nobody shows sympathy to the Russian invading into Ukraine, and in various locations, donation, the funding campaign is launched throughout Japan, and then nobody supports invasion. Despite the price increase so far, the citizens of Japan showed understanding to what has been done by the government of Japan. What about the United Nations? Unfortunately, I have to say that it is already in the state of dysfunctioning. It is no use at all. Such criticism is often heard. Some even go to this extent of suggesting some alternative organization should be established to replace United Nations. That may sound too extreme, but that is because of this. It is such high level of expectation toward the United Nations that people were disappointed, and some thought there could be some alternative organization. Now, how the United Nations is viewed in the world, and we have very interesting data. I'd like to share with you some data. Sorry, it is too busy to see. It was in 2020 when it celebrated 75th anniversary. The Pew Research Center conducted the public opinion survey on 14 advanced nations. The country that least supported the United Nations was Japan. When the question was raised as to which area United Nations has been making contribution, according to the order that is placed from the left, it was about the promoting human rights, 76% on average, but in Japan, it was only 57%. Only 57% of the people thought that the nations was making contribution to human rights. And as to promotion of peace, 74% says yes. In Japan, it was relatively higher among the various the numbers in the Japanese public opinion. 65% said the United Nations is making such an contribution, but in other areas, those who said yes were quite low. And in the same year, this is again the survey conducted by Pew Research Center, and the green shows the proportion of people who have favorable view to the United Nations, and the blue is people with unfavorable. On average, 67% had favorable view, but Japan was second from the last, the following Taiwan. Only 41% had favorable view. Maybe Taiwan is not the recognized as the official member, therefore it is quite understandable, but the Japan is the second lowest. Why is that? That is because of the dysfunctioning of the UN Security Council and the proposals turned down by veto power by China and Russia whenever they don't like it. It was not just limited to Ukraine, but also for the past 10 years or more, it has been repeated again and again.
In the UN, maybe there is a view of the UN in Japan that's a bit distorted. because you see that it is so, the impression is so unfavorable. What is in the background? Well, what kind of organization is the UN? Among the average citizen, maybe there's not an understanding of its role, and maybe that is leading to this distortion. That's how I view it. And a certain diplomat in Japan told me that after I was stationed in Japan, I was very surprised. Japan wants to become a permanent member of the Security Council, and the Japanese government has been acting in that direction. And I thought that was the wish of the people. But the average citizen has no or very little interest in the UN and in the government's actions. So looking back in my compulsory education days, I don't really remember education as in being taught in the schools. And also looking back on my past 30 years working life, well, I also feel, well, if without the UN, who is going to act to the situation in Ukraine? And so that kind of structure of the world perhaps should be taught in the schools as part of education. And also, I think there is an issue with how media reports the UN. And if I talk about this, I think I will be talking a long time, so I will touch on this in another opportunity. So it's been about 80 years since the UN was started. And there are many reforms perhaps necessary in the 21st century, but in 1945, the understanding or the objective was that this kind of situation was never to be repeated, but we are now seeing such a situation in Ukraine. This war could lead to a momentum where the UN could be viewed favorably, and that is what I hope. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. EBARA. And we've been talking, centering on the Ukraine crisis, but the view in Japan in 2020 and 2021 was also reported, and Ms. EBARA talked about the perception in Japan, and we also heard from the other panelists. And Ms. Nakamitsu, you may want to respond on or explain a certain number of points. And I think we took up a lot of time with the opening remarks. So if you could give your reaction, Ms. Nakamitsu, for maybe about 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you very much. They were very important and supportive comments about the UN, and I felt somewhat encouraged, supportive, meaning that the UN can not necessarily solve problems immediately, but in a crisis that we see now, I think it is to be understood that the solutions are very difficult, and there are things that we are doing that can be done, and we need to pile up such efforts, and all the members of the UN family should be gathered together so that what cannot be done can be done, and such efforts should continue to be accumulated. And on that point, I completely agree. And well, the UN Security Council is not able to function very well. That's a problem. But in a sense, this kind of large issue cannot have a quick fix. You have to think about the combination of various measures. And I believe there are probably many specific questions, and as time allows, I hope to be able to have a discussion with the panelists. I'll give it back to you.
Thank you. From now on, I'd like to start more extensive discussion with Ms. Nakamitsu participating. We received some questions beforehand, and also today we received some questions. And overwhelmingly, the most frequently asked questions was about the Security Council reform and also the veto power by Russia demonstrates the Security Council dysfunctioning, but in fact, it was not functioning even before that. And if reform is to be implemented, and then UN Charter itself has to be revised, and again, we have to gain support from the Security Council members, the permanent members, that is. So this is a kind of circular argument. And now the question is whether it is really feasible. If it is not, then what can we expect of UN in the future? In fact, many suggested there is a limitation. And as Ambassador KORSUNSKY mentioned, at the Human Rights Council, discussion took place about removing Russia as a member, and then what about Security Council, whether there could be such a discussion. And as Ambassador suggested, then should we expel Russia from UNESCO? Some of the questions are already known, that is extremely difficult because of many hurdles, but then can we just stay here without doing anything? And then turning to the government of Japan or to Ambassador KORSUNSKY or to media, I'd like to ask those three people focusing on Security Council reform about your views, and also as another topic about the major crisis that could be more serious, like a food shortage and the refugees crisis, how the United Nations are trying to work on such crisis, what kind of measures are to be taken as emergency measures as well as the long-standing measures. And then what is the role of Japan? Because time is limited, I'd like to ask each panelist to refer to those points. So if you can refer to the points that I have just mentioned. And also another point that is about the views by the people toward the United Nations. We received a question from a university student. What can students do in view of the plight of Ukrainian evacuees? I believe there are many student audience today. So if you can also answer the question as to what the students can do. I know time is limited, so I can only give you 2-3 minutes to you all, and Ms. Nakamichi will answer last. So I'd like to ask Mr. ARIMA first, followed by Ambassador, followed by Moriyama-san, and so on. You are muted. Thank you very much for the comprehensive summary. I will try to be brief. First, about the Security Council reform, as was pointed out by Ms. EBARA. In 2021, according to the public opinion survey, 88% of the people supported Japan joining the Security Council as a permanent member. But of course, given the reasons that I mentioned earlier, it is not easy to reform Security Council. And in 2005, there was a situation when the resolution was almost win the 2/3 of support, yet it failed, and ever since the member states are rather exhausted. But those that call for reform have to maintain their efforts, otherwise it will never come to reality. And therefore, we believe Japan is qualified to be the member of the Security Council, and therefore, together with the like-minded countries, we should continue our activities for reform of the Security Council within the United Nations. And at the same time, we also have to work on strengthening the functions of UN organizations and affiliated bodies. And as to the food shortage, including support and aid through international organizations, we should take every possible measures and contributions so that this crisis will never develop into a serious situation. And as to what students can do, of course, each individual student has a limit to what he or she can do, but hope that you will maintain your interest in international situation, develop your own views, and whatever the career path that you might choose in the future, hope that you would choose a profession that would be related in one way or another. This is all that I can offer for now. Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Korsunsky.
Yes, I would like to say, answering the question, that yes, we think that Russia should be expelled from United Nations Security Council. Russia should be expelled from United Nations system at all. Russia should reapply after it become democratic state to be a member of international community, responsible member. As to United Nations Security Council, definitely veto power should be reconsidered. Whether it will be majority or 2/3, it's a question, but the number of countries should be extended, definitely taking into account regional representation, fair, and the major powers, I mean economic powers. Of course, Japan is qualified, it is out of question. There are different models again, but we are wasting time discussing those models and saying how difficult it is. We should act. As to students, it's very important if you help your Ukrainian counterparts who arrive to Japan and who try to accommodate with culture, with language, and with difficulties in many universities they admitted. And please take into account they are your friends. They are under huge stress. They almost all of them lost their homes and their relatives. But be friendly, try to help them, and definitely pay attention to international affairs. Your opinion is very much important when you vote for the government, for your representatives in the parliament. This is extremely important that the young generation of Japan would better understand international reality.
はい、ありがとうございます。大使、Thank you very much. では続きまして、
Thank you
森山
very much. And now, Moriyama-san, and can you talk about what a university student can do, and can you give your report from the field? Me? Yes, Moriyama-san, go ahead. Well, as I said before, more than 100 million people, I said, and there are many solutions that has to be considered multilaterally. And there are some difficult issues involved. And with regards to refugees, we do have successful examples, and that should be kept in mind. And I mentioned the inclusiveness or inclusion of the refugees so that they will not be a burden. And we need to see such a policy transition. As for students, in Africa and Afghanistan too, there is high interest among the young people towards Japan. In other words, there are opportunities for the young people to go outside and communicate the good aspects of Japan. And I believe that such an exchange is very important.
Thank you. Now, EBARA-san, please. Thank you. First, about Security Council reform. Needless to say, in the international community, when Japan declares its initiative working on UN reform, of course, Japan has to make extra effort working together with the members of the international community and like-minded countries. And if Japan becomes a permanent member of the Security Council, what kind of responsibility that means? This is something that we have to deepen our understanding within Japan. That is because the threat to security and peace, if it emerges elsewhere in the world, just like in Ukraine, then there could be a situation when the exercising the military force has to be decided and has to move the international community to that direction. That's a kind of responsibility that Japan may be expected to perform, whether Japan is really willing to take on that responsibility. That kind of discussion should be further deepened. At least that question should be raised in Japan. And as to what students can do about refugees and evacuees and international laws, not only reading about them, but also about, for instance, the 1,000 Ukrainians that are now in Japan. Maybe you will find some Ukrainians coming into the town that you live. So rather than looking at the war, something far away from Japan, actually, it is something close to us, producing a significant impact to our society. It is quite an unfortunate event, yet this is a very good opportunity to learn about such impact that is felt in Japan as well. So, to students, if you find out the Ukrainian friends around you, or whether there are any books about international laws, please start looking into those questions with interest. Thank you. Now, Nakamitsu-san, please. Thank you very much. Situation is extremely difficult. We can't expect the quick solution overnight because of structural problems that are inherent in the United Nations system. That is a fact. To rectify the situation, what has to be done? First, you have to have a sense of ownership. In other words, all the member states have to realize that it is their responsibility. If I can quote, one ambassador that is a close friend to me, who is stationed in the United Nations, he is quite influential, although he represents a small country. The permanent member of the Security Council is not fulfilling its responsibility. Security Council is not functioning. We hear such criticism almost every day, but according to the ambassador from a small country, he says, we are the United Nations. All of us are the United Nations, meaning the strong sense of ownership of the challenges and crises. And such is the most important in trying to work on reform of the United Nations. Therefore, another small country, Liechtenstein, took an initiative in drafting resolution, which was eventually adopted by consensus, calling for explanation when the veto power is exercised. Such initiative is something that even the citizens should be aware of and try to raise awareness that when the United Nations are functioning, that leads to the safety and security of each one of us. Hope that that is understood by the citizens level. So from that point of view, what students can do, there are a lot, and their role is quite important. How to raise awareness internationally among the public opinion, and including Security Council members, from all the countries, how the youth can be united to raise their voice. That's something that I like to ask Japanese students to consider. Nowadays, given the virtual tools and technologies, civil society can unite their efforts, and that is now easier thanks to technology. And as in the case of climate change, where we saw the strong power by the united youth, hope that that could be reproduced Again,
So as a staff in the Secretariat of the UN, I feel because we have a difficult situation that we need to communicate what is taking place in real and propose or recommend policies and look for the solution. Ultimately, the difficult solutions can only be resolved through negotiations. And every day at the headquarters of the UN, I feel this to be the case. So it should be such a forum, and we should make the efforts to support this. Of course, most of the efforts will be behind the scenes, but they can be done in many fora. And the Secretary General is always saying that mankind had made possible many things that seemed impossible. We have such a history, so to make things possible, we need young people, we need all the member states to raise their voices, and as a result, the UN could make as much contributions as possible, or we will be able to create such a situation. Thank you very much. And we heard from Nakamitsu-san at the end, and we are using the advantages of being able to have this remote conference. And we had the participation of Nakamitsu-san, as well as the participants from Tokyo and other areas. And we've exceeded the time, so I cannot go into detail in the wrap-up. When we think about the UN, I think the viewers often think of the headquarters in New York, but I think you should know what kind of efforts the UN is making on the ground. And also, as Nakamitsu-san mentioned, and other panelists mentioned, the UN ultimately is made up of its member states. In other words, you have to think about the UN as a total sum of member states, but still, I think there is a strength that can make the impossible possible, and that would be bigger than the sum of the parts. So the constituents are ultimately individuals, and as the university student mentioned, each individual has to take an interest and take ownership of the issues. And in such an environment, think about how things can progress and move forward and make such efforts. Our time was limited today, and I would like to once again express my appreciation to the panelists. If you could show our panelists once again on the screen, and also I'd like to thank our viewers. So we talked about limitations and possibilities of the UN, the international community, and what individuals should think about and should do. And I hope that it would be fortunate if even one or two aspects remained with you. The UN reform is going to be a difficult path, but there is the crisis of the international community, and therefore, even after this webinar closes, I hope that you can think about that on a daily basis. And lastly, when exiting, we'd like to ask our viewers to cooperate with the questionnaire. And with regards to the Ukraine crisis, JIIA has implemented many webinars, and we have also published many reports, and we would like to think about them together with you. Therefore, please access our website, and also please register on our mail magazine. Once again, I'd like to express my appreciation to our panelists and also our viewers. And with that, I would like to close the seminar for today. Thank you very much, speakers, as well as viewers.